Thank you. Since the inception of urban design over 50 years ago, urban design has been considered a separate discipline. My premise tonight is that when combined, urban design improves architectural thinking, and conversely, architectural thinking helps to improve urban design. This is not meant to be a manual or guidelines about the two subjects. It's more of a critique of how we see and understand things around us and consider how we might think of changes. A recent book edited by my design partner of 35 years, Chan Krieger, suggests that there are at least 10 domains in which professionals practice urban design, while keeping in mind that other domains may be simultaneously at play. My discussion tonight will focus primarily on the association between architecture and urban design and how and where their combination helps us to think critically about our urban environment. It's important to take the attitude that urban design is a frame of mind, not just a discipline. Now, as we know, architects are quite a diverse group of individual practitioners. The client, equally diverse, needs to clearly describe a program for the architect to work on, which is not always very clear. The architect then needs to properly interpret that program and develop a scheme that fulfills the client's endeavors, and to some extent, at times large and small, to develop the architect's own aspirations. The architect then works with a host of engineers and advisors to develop a set of construction documents, and then those documents are turned over to a contractor and subcontractor to interpret and execute. More often than not, a satisfactory piece of design is executed or realized. What is often forgotten is the context in which a piece of architecture is built. Besides the physical and environmental context, there are often historical references, cultural background, social influences, visions and dreams to be realized, and special conditions that may challenge conventional approaches in terms of developing a solution. Eventually, concepts and design translates program and context through a series of diagrams, drawings, and models that reflect certain patterns and relationships. The exercise of developing design solutions for architecture and urban design are very similar. I will demonstrate. For example, let's consider the planning and design of one of Boston's great public spaces, Copley Square. The space is framed by the Boston Public Library. Its formal facade almost centered onto this plaza in front of it. The Copley Plaza Hotel similarly has a relationship to that same plaza. Trinity Church has a smaller little plaza in front of it, of which it's on axis, but Hancock Tower and Trinity Place is also aligned with that same space, and a vehicular drop-off, more formal arrival and departure point intersects all of that. There's a series of T stations that channel people from the intersection towards these two formal spaces and pass beyond. Boylston Street is a relatively uniform retail street in which a series of landscape and trees help to reinforce that edge, as well as a smaller group of trees in front of the hotel. The secondary facade of Trinity Church has a bosque of trees so that the front of the church is well set up, but it also adds to, along with another group of trees and a fountain, this landscape edge that buffers the formal spaces from the busyness of Boylston Street, but also brings the sort of landscape edge into that plaza. Now, such an exercise in thinking of, say, a typical apartment can be very similar. For example, if you want to think of where you might want to put a bed, and you like sunlight to come streaming through, but given the lack of walls, there's only one piece of furniture. So you might say, well, that bed is also semi-private, but at the same time, your bed partner has to walk around that bed in order to get out of that room. So you might think, oh, let's move that bed to the opposite wall. I get an extra piece of furniture. Sunlight still comes in, but it's over my head. The bed is still semi-private, and circulation is a little bit better. Perhaps a third solution would be on the side, amount of furniture, the bed is more prominent as one looks into the room, and circulation is equally divided. You may feel, though, that this room is inadequate for your tastes or your needs, so you're going to convert and think of converting the other bedroom into a more elaborate suite, especially since it has both east and south light, and it's totally private from the doorway. And you take it a step further, well, at that point, we wouldn't need the extra bedroom and the bathroom, and we'll create a much nicer living room, which can be featured as one walks in, and you have more flexibility in how you use that space. Now, if we squint and imagine that windows and doorways are, say, street corridors or building, and the rooms are building facades, we may get some sort of diagram that looks like this. Overlaid streets, blocks, parks, circulation patterns, deferring to sunlight coming in during the morning and afternoon. So the graphic exercise is quite similar if we think of both architecture and urban design as a designer's element. Now, architecture doesn't always begin with context or environment. It begins with perhaps a fundamental structure of what it wants to be and needs to be. The simplest form of structure is the so-called primitive hut. In the most natural setting, the primitive hut is a mere shelter, in this case, a tropical outhouse. But there can be regional interpretations of such a structure. There can be architectural mimicry, whether it's classical or brick. There can be influences set by site-specific conditions. There can be stylistic whims. There can be advances through materials and manufacturing. There can be misguided attempts towards efficiency or hierarchy. There can be humor in being unabashed, yet private. That's a mirrored outhouse that you can see out, but you can't see in. Or there can be unabashed use that is entirely public. There can be adaptive reuse. And there can be promotion and revenue production. Now, in all of those cases, in a nutshell, the product of architecture is largely centered on physical elements. Any connection to urban design is mostly through the design, the site, and regulatory elements. So you can see a lot of these things are related to equipment, wiring, etc. The measure of success of architecture is often esoteric and subjective, although there are many attempts to codify that measure of success. Here, Vitruvius dicta that architecture should be beautiful, useful, and durable, or durable, useful, and beautiful. But given our diverse social and intellectual population, even formal measures can be interpreted, misinterpreted, and outright modified. As an infamous pirate of the Caribbean once said, codes are only guidelines. So, given that diversity and our ever-evolving design exploration, we develop a diverse body of architecture that reflects many things to different people and different things to many people. How we judge this work depends on our cultural, social, and educational backgrounds, just as we were looking at those swings in different contexts. But judgment is not always rational. Here, ranked 22nd of America's favorite architecture is an oversized pseudo-Italianate palazzo built 12 years ago in Las Vegas. It's 3 ranks above Trinity Church, designed by one of America's greatest architects, H.H. Richardson, in 1877. Style sometimes, aside from style, we often have an intuition of what is good or bad. We are conditioned to like such facades in many of the streets of Boston. But we also should feel that something is very wrong when we see something like this. We can understand that some buildings work very well within their context and complementing their context. In other instances, we can also conclude that they don't work very well at all. Now, urban design, while architecture focuses primarily on the object, urban design primarily concentrates and considers the larger issues surrounding the object. Again, as you can see, the overlaps are in words like design, site, and scales of physical elements. Urban design has come to be known as large plans, determining the direction, scale, and pattern of urban evolution. Urban design plans often work from a determination of what is good, what is desirable, or what is less desirable, how things fit together, and how things are linked in a cohesive manner. The mitigating element is largely the public spaces that help unify and transition from one place to another. More often than not, urban design are just mere guidelines and takes many years to realize, and it's interpreted by future designers. A measure of success would be the quality of materials, and in this case, a federal courthouse and a civic square, that the urban design plan was interpreted in a pleasing way. Boston's Copley Square is one such place. However, it could have been very different if Huntington Avenue was allowed to remain as a through street passing by Trinity Church. And we could imagine commercial development could have happened there. Now, how urban design is used to respond to change is not entirely satisfactory. The replacement of the central artery, which cuts through a tight fabric of Boston, creating a corridor for the highway. What was once a dense urban fabric was replaced. The highway was replaced by a greenway. That greenway, the recent reaction to it has not always been positive. It has been tepid. The 27 acres, while green and full of light, replaces a highway with a space corridor that is 50% wider than Commonwealth Avenue. The relative absence of trees, buildings, and activity exacerbates the scale of that open space. Since Boston is known for its many squares, perhaps it's not too late in some distant future that the Greenway have an opportunity to evolve, and perhaps using the scale of Copley Square as a model, that 7 of such squares can be laid down along the Greenway, and the spaces between may allow the city to knit, reknit, and repair itself. Comparison of the two. Speaking of Boston squares. The grandest one, of course, is Boston City Hall Plaza. Here, serving its civic function at its best. But it's most criticized when we are not celebrating our sports team successes. But the question is the criticism correctly directed at the size and materials of that space? Piazza San Marco, a known successful civic space, has a similar size and type of material in the plaza as well, and it's surrounded by buildings similarly, but a bit older, more uniform. Here you can see the comparison of the two in scale. What's different, most different, are the activities along its edges. San Marco is lined with commercial activity all along its perimeter. There's plentiful seating. Nightlife, art displays, carnivals are a recurring feature, particularly lighting, inviting participation in activity. City Hall Plaza can have the same. These are some ideas generated over the years that people have sent in of how we can rejuvenate that space. And we could even be playful and have selective programming events that also is carnival in effect. So what possible elements might there be? Right now, government buildings with live activity, perhaps some commercial activity along the edges to provide 24/7 activity, some landscape, some improved paths, especially, say, Hanover Street extending back, Hanover Street towards North End, improving the connection to the harbor. Some water feature, perhaps on the surface that can be turned off when you need room for large crowds. Improving access to the subway, even modifying the edges of City Hall itself. So far, the one edge of City Hall Plaza is improved by a pergola that provides some lighting, some seating, some shade. What hasn't been done is utilizing the structural columns to string screens for evening shows. That's never been done, but they are capable of implementing. Just improving the lighting of City Hall itself can transform the character of the place, just as it was when it was initially built. It's the underfunded maintenance that makes the plaza and the building look less desirable. The building itself has been subject of ideas and competitions. Just some recent concepts by some creative young architects here in Boston of transforming the building, making it more engaging, more connected to its exterior, allowing more penetration into the building and pedestrian circulation through the building, activating the building with uses that invite people in. Outside of Boston City Hall, there's always envisioned that it plays a part in this sort of walk to the sea, this connection from Beacon Hill all the way to Long Wharf. But it's always had some trouble in terms of the pedestrian crossing at this busy middle intersection, or it's not an intersection, a mid-block crossing. One solution might be to continue that deck of City Hall as a bridge and terminating at a grand stair and an elevator that would actually make, finally, City Hall Plaza pedestrian accessible or handicap accessible. Now, this is the back of Faneuil Hall. It's always been a very congested and busy place, and now it's a dock square that accommodates quite a lot of activity, and a connection that safely brings people across and participate in the activity is one thing that will help reinforce that square. So all the above musings have looked at integrating the physical intervention between architecture and urban design. Not discussed, as you can imagine in Boston, are the many political, economic, regulatory, and other obstacles that make such musings possible. However, if we do not use our imagination and dreams of visions, then surely things will not change. So the next time you sit on a swing, think of your environment and wonder how it can be made better and engage yourself into realizing. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Sir?
Do you think public policy can have a vision, or is a vision by committee?
Of course, it's always possible. Back in the 70s, public policy was the urban design vehicle to implement change. It was done in New York City. It developed specific guidelines of where things should go, what scale should be, how view corridors should be framed, and it provided specific guidelines for a developer of thinking about where lobby should go, where entrance should go, where a building might play in the overall circulation through an area. So yes, absolutely, public policy can be effective. It's a question of staff, the ability of staff to work with developers and architects. Certainly the BRA has quite a lot of experience in that. So yes, definitely it's possible. Yes.
You know, one thing, showing all those slides of Boston City Hall, it seems like people have thought about this place a lot, and it doesn't seem to be that hard of a problem to solve.
Yes.
And so I'm just wondering what your take is on why we can't seem to, you know, these things that really are not, you know, cutting edge architecture or urban design to solve the problem.
That's a very good question. And I think we all have asked ourselves why. It's probably many, many factors. Certainly there needs to be some political will. It needs to be money. It can be very expensive to do this. It's a very hard building. It would probably take more energy in today's sustainable consciousness to tear this building down than to build a building to replace it, because it's such a hard structure. But in modern buildings such as this, there are many, many examples of how they can be absolutely adaptable for reuse. Some of the drawings that you saw even enclose that atrium with a skylight to make an interior space. Certainly penetrating through the building is another way of having the building engage its surroundings. Modern buildings can tolerate such interventions actually a lot more than historic buildings. You can imagine trying to do this to, say, the White House. No, you just can't, right? But modern buildings can. And I believe the architects of this building would invite such ideas and would be open to such things. It would be a shame to not find a solution of how to reuse, add to this building at all. It's a question of leadership, for sure, codes and other regulations that will allow this, but certainly cost is a major factor. Yes?
Since architects were once urban designers, since the beginning of time, until some point that urban design began to be considered something separate, I'm wondering why you think it became separated, and are you suggesting that it should not be, that it should be part of a regular architecture curriculum?
Yes. Well, it wasn't formally known as urban design. That term was termed by Jose Luis Sert, dean of the Graduate School of Design in the mid-50s. And his interpretation was combining the various disciplines of architecture, landscape architecture, and planning to address the whole specific issue of urban development, urban change. We can infer that those who think of the context in architecture, in design architecture, are urban designers. I think in the last 50 years, there's been more of a codification of what urban designers do. There are landscape urban designers. There are policy urban designers. My own personal interpretation and our practice interpretation is that it's a discipline that informs architecture and vice versa. I forget what was the second half of your question.
As far as education?
Yes. Well, I absolutely firmly support that. Too often, urban design is an elective that's taught, say, towards the end of one's architecture education, if one's an undergraduate, that's 4th or 5th year. Given the analysis or awareness of things around you, the context, I believe it should be introduced as early as possible. It's now very often a graduate degree program as a specific degree in graduate school after one gets a first degree in architecture. Yes, sir.
With regards to the Greenway, I can't help but compare it to the High Line in New York, and they expect to have 1 million visitors going to that elevated railroad bed structure. What do you think could have been done better on the Greenway to have become more of a magnet destination?
Well, you saw some drawings that indicate how bring activity into it. The High Line is much narrower than the Greenway.
But I mean, the Greenway, there was certainly money spent. So what could have been?
Or what could have been? It could have allowed buildings within the greenways. I mean, there's debate on whether or not it should be a continuous green open space that's 300 feet wide in some areas, or can it be more of a checkerboard condition, so that development between open spaces would allow street activity. So when you're walking across the greenway, you aren't just walking across a wide open space, but you can walk along city blocks, for example. That's one way. But to facilitate that, it would have been if some foresight was put into foundations underneath to allow larger structures. And right now it does not have that capability. And the only thing that's allowed on the Greenway are nonprofit organizations, which may not have the financial ability to take on the extra costs of building over a tunnel. So those are some of the things. Even building, installing larger trees just to provide shade and scale on the Greenway would have helped the Greenway itself and giving it some height, some shade as one walks along it. Right now it's so vacuous that there really is no reason to be there. Yes?
Lawrence, don't you think we're losing an opportunity at Harbor Towers by not reconsidering the possibility of the highest line terminating at that site, if the harbor rod? If that project is designed in a way that it resolves the sun and the wind conditions, and it's raised up 3 levels with nothing except glass elevator cores and lobbies and cafes and things, which bring thousands of people to the place and with views to the sea. And it goes against the notion of somebody in Copley Square on the 40th floor having their view blocked, but it also opens up the economic and life-giving qualities that maybe the Greenway could use. And it's in the hands of a masterful architect. Just one opinion. What do you think? They're hung up on the height. Everybody's worried that then you see Hong Kong and you see other places in the world. The waterfronts are beautiful and really active. And here we have a chance for a wonderful project, and it's going to get killed. We want a small, fat building. That makes sense?
Well, sure. I don't have an answer for that.
I don't either.
Yeah.
I like your opinion.
Yeah. I have to see the diagram. I'm very visual, so in order to provide an answer. Yeah. But I can't visualize it, not what you just described. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Could you give us your reflection on urban? Could you give us your reflection on urban design in other international cities that's sprawling up really fast and trying to compete with the West?
Well, there's Shanghai that's going up quite fast, but perhaps without a plan, but it's growing very quickly.
I mean, I've seen photographs. I haven't been there actually, like in Dubai and some of these places, Louisiana. It looks pretty scary.
Yes. Too often they are vehicles of economic development without a sort of overall plan for the city. So that is perhaps what is scary about it. Yes, sir.
Now there's a very good urban design effort along the center, which is intended to bring back Bay back together with the South End and come up with Chapman when that's type is dead. What do you think? How do you think that might have gone better? What urban design principles do you think would have helped to make that process fruition or what effort?
Most of it is transportation related in terms of how cars can get in and out and circulate around that. I think the connection to other developments is also something that needs to be investigated. Yeah. Yes, Chris.
So you can hear me in the back. Your practice is one of those in the city that runs the scale from architecture to urban design. And in drawing the comparisons between the two that you did early in your lecture, I wonder if you could talk to the scale's not quite the right word, but everybody's had this experience of making a drawing on your computer on a relatively small screen. And whether you're imagining urban design or architecture, if you have the experience of enlarging it, either projecting it or printing it out large, oftentimes you'll find that what seemed reasonable at a small size when it got bigger didn't work. And you had to go back and make adjustments because of what happens when you get to a bigger scale. Now we're using the same tool to imagine both architectural and urban design solutions. Yet when you get those up to real size, they're quite different. And so while there are similarities between the two conceptually and intellectually, there's also this realistic human thing that enters into it. And how do you kind of deal with that intellectually within the practice?
I think it's more of a discipline, an approach to designing. That obviously is very different when you're designing a kitchen versus designing a whole city. But thinking of all the influences besides the object itself, how it responds to its adjacencies, how one uses it, how it's connected. So the example of the kitchen, for example, there's a certain circulation pattern that goes through it. Whereas how it's adjacent to the dining room and living room. These are approaches of thinking about design. Where would you put a certain piece of furniture? So when you think about a city in a similar manner, how does one district relate to another? How does one block relates to another? One building relates to another? Where can you put in open space? How can it energize certain human activity? Not very different from a kitchen, where you could gravitate in front of the dining room table, or there's a counter on the island facing whoever's cooking. So these are approaches of thinking about human activity, space, and objects that it's a different scale, but the approach is very similar. Lighting, sun coming from a window, where you look out, not very different than looking down a street.